Welcome back to Church in the World. This is part 3 of our discussion of the statement Human Sexuality, Gift, and Trust, the 2009 social statement from the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, of which I'm a pastor. And that statement is about human sexuality of all kinds. We've already talked in part 1 about the biblical foundations for ethics and sexual ethics. In part 2, marriage, family, children, and what most people mean when they say gay marriage. The ELCA chooses to use more specific language, namely publicly accountable, lifelong, monogamous, same-gendered relationships, because one of the things we talked about in that statement is the inability of some people due to their bound conscience to refer to that or perceive those relationships as marriages, and the bound conscience of others who can't help but see it, can't imagine any other way but to see them as marriages. So that's the last 2 videos. Please look at them for those topics. Today we're going to talk about sexuality and responsibility in society, which has a whole bevy of things. The statement goes through very quickly because they're considered mostly non-controversial in the church, but they may not be as non-controversial in society. And some of these things may surprise you. So let's get to it. First of all, individuals and families need healthy and supportive communities, and social community is harmed even when we do something that's private. Something can harm society through us and through our own damage and our own harmful behavior. So we have to appreciate the influence, positive and negative, of social forces and social contexts on human sexual behavior. We have to be ready to speak out when such forces cause harm. In particular, the church opposes all forms of sexual exploitation within and outside the church. Justice for women in church and society must continue to be an important dimension of Lutheran concern and actions, and we'll talk more about women specifically when we get to that social statement. Oh yes, there's a whole statement about it. The church also will attend to the need for equal protection, equal opportunities, and equal responsibilities under the law, and just treatment for those with varied sexual orientation and gender identity. Notice that, right? So while the ELCA has these different positions on the issues of marriage, nevertheless, it's very clear, no, equal protection, responsibility, and opportunity under the law for people regardless of these things. And that means, for example, a lot of the lines you hear about laws around marriages, relationships, and sexual conduct, no, like the ELCA does not support that. Such individuals are that is to say, people in sexual and gender minorities, are disproportionately and negatively affected by patterns of stigma, discrimination, and abuse. Likewise, the church will attend to the particular needs of children and the families of those with actual or perceived differences in sexual orientation or gender identity, because they are especially vulnerable to verbal, physical, emotional, spiritual, psychological, and sexual abuse. We also note as a church with grave concern the commodification of the human body as an economic asset. The sexual body is not to be used ever as an object for commercial purposes. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the global sex trade, which is all across the world, in the United States and abroad, and that people trapped in that system are damaged and often destroyed by degradation, abuse, and sometimes torture, that companies profit from that enterprise, and they need to be identified and strongly denounced. And we support international agreements and national laws to prevent such practices. Remember, this all springs out of the first video, the possibility of profit is not a sufficient moral basis to use human sexuality for purposes that harm individuals or undermine social trust. The ELCA opposes the sale and purchase of pornography. It objects to commercial and technological efforts to sell sex, including mass media and commercial marketing, since these negatively impact individuals and society in significant ways. Christian responsibility includes naming economic forces and monitoring the ways in which they constrain or support healthy individual choices and social structures. The church advocates against all that systematically undermines efforts to raise healthy children and build solid marriages and trusting relationships, including the portrayal of responsible sexuality as abnormal and burdensome, and promiscuous sexual activity as normal and consequence-free. Right? Now, as an excursus, if you don't believe this happens, go watch any drama aimed at any non-elderly demographic, right? Go watch the CW dramas. Go watch some of the ones when I was in seminary. There was several that a friend and I followed. It was kind of like eating very bad ice cream. I don't really know why, um, but it was interesting because it gave me a lens into what the media was feeding uh, teenagers, right, and young adults. And I mean, these were characters who drank constantly, uh, who had definitely had promiscuous relationships. I mean, most characters at some point had sexual congress with every other major character in the cast. Um, this kind of stuff. And so even when, and I'm sure, I mean, there was exploration of unwanted pregnancy, there was exploration of what to do with economic insecurity, there were certainly struggles with depression and loss and all that stuff. And that's kind of the problem, is that media can be complicated, right? It's not just, they don't just put porn on the television, but we do have to be critical um, around what the messages are. Even if some of the messages are good, that doesn't mean they all are, right? Even if some of the handling of certain things is responsible, doesn't mean all of the issues are handled responsibly. We need to be vigilant about that and careful with that, especially around young adults and youth. Okay, cool. Um, the church will respond in situations where business and corporate enterprises seek profit through disrespectful treatment of the human body. We will work with public and private institutions to create structures, policies, and practices of accountability to support social norms of protection. These include codes of practice that protect society, especially children and the most vulnerable, from the misuse and abuse of sexuality for profit. We work with all people to craft fair and comprehensive laws, particularly aimed at protecting the weakest and most vulnerable among us, especially children, from sexual harm. The church supports the development and use of medical products, birth control, and initiatives that support fulfilling and responsible sexuality, right? So remember, and this goes back to a number of different statements, including a statement on abortion, right? Just because the church has said marriage is the appropriate context for sexual intercourse does not mean the church thinks that the church necessarily therefore takes the position that there is something wrong with having contraception available in the society. In fact, we can hold both positions simultaneously. And that kind of throws a lot of people for a loop. So be aware of that. The church recognizes the important role the availability of birth control has played in allowing women and men to make responsible decisions about the bearing and rearing of children, right? It's a good thing for people to be able to choose whether or not they're going to be parents, right? To figure that out and discern that to some extent is important. The church, in its concern for the neighbor, has a responsibility to be concerned about public health issues. We just did the issue of healthcare was last week, I believe. All people who have contracted a sexually transmitted disease have an absolute responsibility to inform their sexual partners and all who are at risk. Very important. Care must be taken in sex education materials and processes to inform about the dangers of diseases without teaching that sexual expression is intrinsically dirty and dangerous, right? That's not what we've been saying through any of this, apparently. Efforts at public education and protection from disease should be supported, right? This includes efforts that challenge stigma and discrimination, especially against those living with and affected by HIV/AIDS. We, including our institutions and agencies, should be an active partner in discussions about how to address and contain epidemics of those diseases. We support social policies and practices that encourage the growth of healthy relationships, and will question publicly those that erode social trust or undermine the structures within which trust is learned and preserved. Example: abuse in the church. We do not tolerate the abuse of the ministerial office for personal sexual gratification. We hold high expectations for those individuals called to serve as rostered leaders. That's ELCA churchy speak for clergy, pastors, deacons, and bishops. The trust placed in them by engaging in promiscuity, infidelity, adultery, or forms of sexual abuse violate these high standards. Such violations severely damage the credibility of the public ministry to which the church and its leaders are called, right? And this is actually very true. Very few things a pastor can do to get removed as a pastor, as a minister from the ELCA, but sexual impropriety, especially as pastor, is definitely one of them. In fact, we've had more than one case in the state of New Jersey where I am, and where my congregation is. In my time as a pastor, I've been aware of it. It generally happens fairly quickly and quietly when something like this happens. There's normally a letter just to let everybody know who the pastor was and that, in very general terms, what the allegation is and what the action has been. Very, very often, the person resigns from the roster without pension and just kind of disappears. Unless there's criminal conduct. If there's criminal conduct, which, please note, a pastor abusing their office to violate their marriage is not actually criminal. In and of itself, they certainly can do that in a way that is criminal, right? But that's not necessarily able to be prosecuted, and so it's very important for us to recognize that we live in a world where the boundaries are kind of weird around legislation of sexual practices and boundaries, and that leads us to the other example, which is the workplace, right? We all know that the workplace can be hostile and dangerous for people, especially women and minorities, especially when supervisors or coworkers or other professionals or clients, especially someone who feels they have some sort of power in the relationship, can abuse it for their own gratification. And that's not only not okay, it should be boundaried, it should be protected against, it should be punished in some way, or there should be some sort of consequence. And insofar as it's possible, the state needs to make laws that protect people so that their workplaces can be safe. The workplace requires appropriate boundaries that are maintained through respect, good sense, best practices, and legal protections. We remain committed to our own efforts to help make congregations, synods, and the church-wide organizations safe and healthy places to live and work. The ALCA does not tolerate sexual harassment within the workplace. Now, that's a whole mouthful, right? We've covered sexual harassment. We haven't necessarily named rape in this statement because we've already talked a little bit about it early in the statement. But it should be very clear, any level of abuse of another human being is not okay, whether sexual or otherwise. Any level of sexual abuse is extremely problematic and not okay within the ELCA. There's zero tolerance for that from pastors or other leaders in the church. There's zero tolerance of even the appearance of it, often actually. Even appearing to be violating sexual standards can really sabotage somebody, even if nothing is going on and nothing was ever going on, because there's an erosion of trust. And this is kind of an excursus on my part, something that's very important to know as a clergy person, as a pastor, is that I need to be aware of my physical boundaries in a way that is different from the way that male colleagues of mine who are now in their 70s and 80s, they never had to worry about certain things, right? Or at least, well, and by they, I do mean they themselves never had to worry about something. That doesn't mean they shouldn't have worried about it. They just didn't have to. And it had never occurred to them that they might. And so, for example, hugging and kissing on the cheek of a person was at one point a very common thing for a pastor to do. In some contexts, in some locations, in the context of certain relationships, etc., right? And some people who pastored for many years in contexts like that don't understand that not everyone has comfort with that kind of contact from their pastor. On the other hand, some persons are too familiar with their pastor. I know of a colleague who was touched inappropriately on Sunday morning in front of the choir by a member of the congregation who was a female, and this colleague was male. And the colleague informed the person that needed to not happen again, that they believed that there was no malicious intent, that there didn't need to be any sort of drama, that they weren't upset, that they weren't angry at this person, but that this person needed to know that wasn't okay and that it shouldn't happen again. If male pastors experience that, I can only begin to imagine what a female pastor or a transgender pastor might experience. And this is in the ELCA in New Jersey. This is not like there are considerably more vulnerable locations. There are considerably more toxic social locations or vulnerable social locations. And that's the pastor, not a member of the congregation, right? So you can imagine, and I'm sure any one of you who is in any sort of minority, there are a number of stories that could be told, right? And so this isn't to inspire sympathy so much as it is to recognize how unboundaried we can be in our society around other people's bodies rather than our own. And that's not okay. And that's really, I think, what this statement is kind of getting at, even with stuff like the sexuality, sexual intercourse outside of marriage thing. Why is that a problem? Because we treat our bodies and other people's bodies like objects that are just there to satisfy our own agendas, our own desires. But our bodies are gifts from God, and they're to be respected, right? And our neighbor is a gift from God who is to be respected, right? And loved. And love doesn't treat people like objects. When I've been asked, how do I summarize this statement? Now, this is the third video. We've been going on and on and on, right? And there's been so many things said. How do we summarize it? This is how I summarize teaching around sexuality. And this is really how I summarize the commandment against adultery in the Ten Commandments. I say, don't treat people like objects because they're not. That's the end of the story. Neither you nor anyone you know is an object. And so we don't objectify each other. We don't act upon others without their consent. We don't engage in relationships just to get something out of someone else. And if we don't do those things, then a great deal of what's in this statement follows. I think that's pretty much the thing, is that we live in a society where everything gets commodified and objectified, and so does everyone increasingly. So what we're looking for is a world where the love of God has so grown in our hearts that not only do we not treat ourselves or our neighbor like objects, but we proclaim and treat them as beloved, as worthy of dignity and respect and care and affection and protection and concern. And it's to that end that we are called. May God help us all create that kind of world for everyone, everywhere, regardless of what they look like, of who they love, of what their relationship status is, of what their biology or parts or whatever are, regardless of what our opinions of their choices are. Because human beings are all bearers of God's image. Everyone is made to be loved by us and respected. So I hope that you will love and respect your neighbors and how you choose to explore your sexuality, especially with any sexual partner that you may have. I hope that this series has been helpful. I know it's been fraught, perhaps, and lengthy, certainly. It's complicated stuff. It's tense stuff. But I hope that you've been served to some extent by it, and that it's alleviated, hopefully, some of the confusion that can happen around sexuality, especially in the ELCA. Thank you for joining me for this. Tomorrow, that is to say the next part, that is the last part, the second part, half of week 6, we'll be talking about the ELCA's statement on genetics. So we're staying in some level of biological realm, but I think we're going to get a little bit more science-y, I hope. And I know almost nothing about that. So I think that's going to be very exciting for everybody. I'll see you then, and until then, God bless.